My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye across my own kitchen table, the same table where my wife and I had shared 31 years of Sunday breakfasts, and said, "You're 67 years old, Ray. What exactly do you need a 4-bedroom house for?" That was 3 days after we buried Gloria. 3 days. I want you to understand something about my wife before I go any further, because none of what comes after makes any sense without her. Gloria wasn't the kind of woman who filled a room by being loud. She filled it by being present. She remembered things. The name of your 3rd-grade teacher, the year your father lost his job, the exact coffee order of every single person who sat at her table more than once. She was a retired school librarian who had spent 40 years teaching kids that stories matter, that words have weight, that what you leave behind tells people who you really were. She had been sick for 2 years, pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you a lot of room to negotiate. In those 2 years, I watched my wife do something I will never fully understand. She didn't rage. She didn't fall apart. She got organized. She called lawyers. She updated paperwork. She had long, quiet conversations on the phone in the sunroom with the door closed. And when I asked her about it, she'd smile and say, "I'm just making sure everything is in order, sweetheart." I thought she meant the finances, the will, the usual things people do when they know the end is coming. I didn't know the half of it. Our son Donnie was 40 years old and worked in commercial real estate. He had a good head for numbers and a poor head for people, which was something Gloria and I had spent decades gently trying to correct. His wife Shauna was the kind of person who smiled with her mouth and watched with her eyes. I had never trusted her completely, and I always felt vaguely guilty about it, the way you feel guilty about not liking a song that everyone else seems to love. They'd been married for 8 years. No children yet, though Shauna often mentioned it in a way that implied it was someone else's fault. They lived 40 minutes away in a newer subdivision with a homeowners association and a community pool that apparently justified a mortgage that made my chest tight just hearing the number. When Gloria died on a Tuesday in October, both of them showed up at the house within the hour. That part was right. That part was what family does. What happened after was something else. It started small. Shauna offering to help organize Gloria's jewelry. Donnie asking, casually, whether I had thought about downsizing while I was still standing at the kitchen counter eating a bowl of soup I didn't taste, because I was running on 3 hours of sleep and a grief so heavy I had to remind myself to stand up straight. I told him this wasn't the time. He agreed. He backed off. But the comments kept coming. Little ones. Sideways ones. The kind you can't quite confront directly because individually they sound almost reasonable. The house is a lot for one person, Dad. Property taxes in this county are brutal, Dad. You know, in assisted living communities, they have people your age who... I stopped him there. I told him I was 67, not 97, and that I had just buried his mother and I would appreciate if he let me get through the week without a sales pitch. He apologized. He looked genuinely sorry, actually, and I thought maybe I had imagined the edge underneath the words. I hadn't. 6 weeks after the funeral, Donnie called and asked if we could have a family meeting. That's what he called it, a family meeting. Like we were going to discuss chores or plan a vacation. I said, sure, come over Sunday. He showed up with Shauna in a leather portfolio that I recognized as something he used for client presentations. I made coffee. I set out the good cups, the ones with the blue flowers that Gloria had bought at a craft fair in Vermont in 2009, and I sat across the table from my son and his wife, and I waited. Donnie opened the portfolio. There were papers inside, printed papers with numbers on them. He said they had been talking, and they thought the most financially responsible thing, responsible was the word used, like a shield, would be to transfer the house into a trust structure that he and Shauna would manage, which would protect me from estate taxes and simplify things considerably. He said it with the smooth confidence of a man who had given this particular speech before to clients who didn't know enough to push back. I looked at my son. I looked at the papers. I looked at Shauna, who was sitting with her hands folded and a small, pleasant expression on her face that didn't move. I said, "Who drew these up?" He named a real estate attorney I didn't recognize. I said, "Not our family attorney." He said this guy was more specialized. I said I'd like to have time to look everything over. Shauna spoke up then. First time she'd said a word since she sat down. She said, "Ray, we're only thinking about what's best for you. You're at an age where these things really need to be in place, and the longer you wait, the more complicated it gets." You're at an age. I looked at her for a moment. She held my gaze without blinking. I said, "I appreciate that. I'll have my attorney review it." The meeting ended shortly after. Donnie hugged me at the door. Shauna smiled. They drove away, and I stood in the entryway of the house where I'd lived for 26 years, where my son had grown up, where Gloria had spent the last morning of her life sitting in the sunroom with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the birds at the feeder, and I felt something cold and clarifying settle on my chest. Not anger exactly, something quieter than anger, something with more patience in it. I called my attorney the next morning, Philip Garrett, who had handled my affairs for 15 years and who had the very useful quality of being impossible to rattle. I told him about the meeting. I told him about the papers. There was a pause on his line. He said, "Ray, don't sign anything. Bring it to me." I did. 2 days later, I sat across from Philip and watched him read through the documents with his reading glasses perched at the end of his nose and an expression that told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. He set the papers down. He took his glasses off. He said, "This transfers beneficial ownership of the property to a joint LLC in Donnie and Shauna's names. You would retain the right to live there, but they would control the asset. Any decision about the property, sale, refinancing, rental, would require their approval, not yours." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That's not a trust to protect me." Philip said, "No, it is not. Here's where I need to back up and tell you something that Donnie did not know, and that Shauna definitely did not know, and that I myself had only partially understood when Gloria explained it to me in one of those sunroom conversations the summer before she died. The house was not in my name. It was not in our joint names, as I had assumed for 26 years. When we had refinanced in 2008, Gloria, who handled all our paperwork with the terrifying competence of a woman who had once organized an entire school district's archival system, had structured the title in her name alone, for reasons related to some business liability issue with a rental property I had owned briefly and stupidly in the 90s. I had signed something vaguely at some closing without reading it carefully, the way you do when you trust your wife completely and she says it's just a formality. The house was Gloria's. And Gloria, in those 2 years of quiet phone calls and closed sunroom doors, had decided what to do with it. She had left the house to me. That part was straightforward, but she had also placed it in a revocable trust that had converted to an irrevocable trust the moment she passed. A trust that named me as the sole beneficiary for the duration of my life, and that specified, in language that Philip described as unusually precise for a document this size, that no transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the property could occur without the written approval of the trustee. The trustee was not me. The trustee was not Donnie. The trustee was a woman named Beverly Marsh, who had been Gloria's closest friend since they were both 24 years old and working at the same branch library in Columbus. Beverly, who lived in Portland now and whom I hadn't seen in 2 years, had apparently been on the phone with Gloria regularly in those final months. Beverly, who had a law degree she'd never practiced, but had never let lapse. Beverly, who had, I learned this from Philip with something close to awe, also been named as the executor of a secondary document that addressed the disposition of Gloria's retirement accounts and a small but meaningful brokerage account I hadn't known existed. Gloria had been a librarian for 40 years. What she had been doing in those 40 years, quietly in the background, was investing. Index funds mostly. Automatic contributions. Small amounts that turned into larger amounts because she had started when she was 26 and never stopped. The brokerage account was worth a little over $380,000. They went to me outright in my name with no strings. I sat with this information for several days before I did anything with it. I thought about Gloria at 26, opening a brokerage account with a deposit she probably pulled from her first real paycheck, telling nobody because she didn't want it to feel like pressure or a statement or a plan that someone else might want to redirect. I thought about her at 40, at 50, watching that number grow in the background while she organized library collections and made casseroles and helped Donnie with his homework and sat with me through my own career stumbles and never once mentioned it. I thought about what it means to love someone so quietly and so completely that your greatest acts of devotion are invisible until after you're gone. I cried about that for a while. I'm not ashamed of it. Then I called Philip back and told him I was not going to sign Donnie's papers. I told him to draft a letter to Donnie's attorney explaining the current title and trust structure, and to do it formally, on letterhead, because I wanted there to be a record. Philip asked if I wanted to give Donnie a chance to discuss it privately first. I thought about that. I thought about Shauna's folded hands and her small, unmoving smile. I thought about you're at an age. I said to send the letter. What happened next is something I'm not proud of in the sense that I take no pleasure in watching my son come apart. But I also won't pretend I wasn't prepared for it. Donnie called me 2 days after the letter arrived. He was not calm. He said there had obviously been some mistake, that Mom would have told him about a trust, that he was sure the documents I had weren't what I thought they were. He said it in the voice he used when he was trying to be reasonable while feeling the opposite. I let him talk. When he was finished, I said, "There's no mistake, Donnie. Your mother made her wishes very clear." He said, "When were you going to tell me?" I said, "I'm telling you now." Then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "Did she not trust me?" And I had to decide, in that moment, what kind of answer to give him. I could have been gentle. I could have said something about estate planning being complicated, about these decisions not being personal. Instead, I said, "I think she trusted you completely to be exactly who you are. She just made sure everything would be okay either way." There was a long silence. He said he needed some time to process. I said I understood. What I didn't tell him on that call was the rest of it, because there was more. In the weeks after the letter went out, Philip had been doing some additional work on my behalf, reviewing financial records and tracing some account activity that had come to his attention through the estate process. What he found was that Donnie and Shauna had, over the previous 18 months, been routing a portion of the management fees from 2 properties Gloria had co-invested in with them, a small arrangement she had entered into several years ago as a way of helping them build equity into an account that was not disclosed in the partnership documents. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it wasn't nothing. And more importantly, it was not their money. Philip laid it out for me carefully. He said we had options. We could let it go. We could demand repayment quietly and close the matter, or we could pursue it formally. I asked him what Gloria would have done. He thought about that for a minute. He said, "Gloria would have made sure it couldn't happen again." I said, "That's what I want to do." Philip sent a second letter. This one was addressed to both Donnie and Shauna. It detailed the discrepancy, cited the relevant sections of the partnership agreement, and requested repayment within 30 days, along with a full accounting of all management fees for the previous 3 years. It also noted, in a single quiet sentence at the end, that the partnership interests in both properties would be reviewed for potential restatement given the irregularities identified. Shauna called me the next morning. I had not spoken directly to Shauna since the Sunday of the leather portfolio. She said my name and then she said, "I want you to know that this was a bookkeeping error. Nothing more. We would never intentionally." I said, "Shauna, my attorney will be your point of contact going forward." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ray, we're family." I said, "Yes, we are. My attorney will be your point of contact." I hung up. I sat in a sunroom where Gloria used to drink her chamomile and watch the birds, and I looked out at the feeder, which was empty because I'd been forgetting to fill it, and I felt something I hadn't felt since October. Not happy, exactly. Not vindicated. Something more like settled, like a knot that had been pulled tight for months had finally been allowed to ease. I got up and found the bag of birdseed in the pantry and filled the feeder. The repayment came within the 30 days. A certified check, through Shauna's attorney, she apparently had one now, for the full amount plus the additional accounting Philip had requested. Donnie did not call. He did not write. Shauna did not call again. For several weeks, I sat with the silence and let it be what it was. Then, on a Saturday in February, Donnie came to the house alone. He didn't call ahead. I saw his car in the driveway and I thought about not opening the door. And then I thought about what Gloria would think of me not opening the door, and I went and opened it. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been having a series of conversations he didn't know how to have. He asked if he could come in, and I said yes, and I put coffee on, because that is what you do. We sat at the kitchen table. He wrapped both hands around his mug, the way he used to do when he was a teenager, and came home late and knew I was going to ask him something he didn't want to answer. He said, I didn't know what Shauna was doing with the accounts. I looked at him. He said, I found out when the letter came. She told me it was an accounting issue, and I believed her, and then I kept asking questions, and he stopped. He set the mug down. He said, I don't know how much you want to know about what's happening between us. I said, I don't need the details. That's between you and her. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I shouldn't have pushed you on the house. I knew it felt wrong, and I let Shauna convince me it was the responsible thing, and he stopped again. Mom would have hated it. I said, yes. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the edges. He said, do you think she knew about the accounts? I thought about Gloria at 58, watching this from somewhere, probably already 3 steps ahead. I said, I think your mother knew everything she needed to know. He was quiet for a long time after that. We drank our coffee. Outside, at the feeder I had refilled, 2 cardinals were taking turns, a male and a female, which is what cardinals do. The bright red one and the softer brown red one, both at the same small tray. Donnie saw me looking at them. He said, Mom loved cardinals. I said, she thought they were good luck. He said, did you? I thought about that. I thought about a woman who had spent 40 years quietly building something no one could take away, who had spent her last months making sure the people she loved would be protected in ways they didn't even know to ask for, who had trusted her oldest friend with a job that required both heart and precision, and who had done all of it without making it a burden or a statement or a scene. I said, I do now. Donnie comes by most Sundays. He and Shauna are separated, which is their business and not mine to narrate. He brings donuts from the bakery on Route 9 that he knows I like. The glazed ones, plain, nothing fancy. And he sits at the kitchen table, and sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't, and that's enough. He's working on becoming someone his mother would have recognized. I think he'll get there. Beverly flew in from Portland in the spring to go over the trust documents in person and to sit in the sunroom and drink chamomile tea, which she had not touched in 20 years but felt was the right thing to do given the circumstances. We talked for a long time about Gloria, about the things she said and the things she planned and the way she always knew, somehow, where every story was going before it got there. Beverly said, she told me once that the most powerful thing a person can do is make sure that love outlasts them. That's why she did all of it. Not because she was angry, because she loved you. I'm 67 years old. I live in the same house I've lived in for 26 years, with the blue flower cups and the full bird feeder and the sunroom where the light comes in. Perfect in the late afternoon. I keep a picture of Gloria on the table by the window, one from 2011 when we were in Vermont, when she was laughing at something I'd said that I can't even remember now, her head tilted back, completely unguarded. Some people think that at 67 a man is mostly finished, that he's a thing to be managed, an asset to be repositioned, a problem to be solved before it gets complicated. Gloria knew better. She spent 2 years quietly making sure I'd be okay, not just financially, but in every way that counts. She gave me the house, the trust, the friendship of Beverly Marsh, and one last reminder that the woman I had chosen to spend my life with was, from the first day to the last, the smartest person in any room she ever entered. I didn't need an inheritance meeting to know that, but I'm glad she made sure everyone else figured it out too. I keep thinking about something Beverly said when she flew in from Portland that spring. She said Gloria told her once that the most powerful thing a person can do is make sure their love outlasts them. I've turned that over in my mind more times than I can count, because it's not a sentimental idea. It's actually a very precise one. Love that outlasts you has to be built. It has to be thought through. It doesn't happen by accident. Gloria was the most decent person I ever knew, and I don't use that word lightly. Decent doesn't mean passive. It doesn't mean she looked the other way when things weren't right. It means she held herself to a standard even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. She never once used what she had to punish anyone. She just used it to protect what mattered. That distinction, I've come to believe, is the whole thing. That's the difference between a person who is merely clever and a person who is genuinely good. Because Donnie and Shauna were clever too in their way, they had the papers drawn up, they had the pitch rehearsed, they knew the right words. Responsible, simplified, protective, and they wore them like a suit. But cleverness without integrity is just a shortcut that eventually runs out of road. The moment Philip's letter arrived, everything they had built on assumption collapsed, because it wasn't built on anything real. It was built on the belief that a 67-year-old man wouldn't know what he was signing. That's not a plan. That's a gamble on someone else's ignorance. What Gloria had built was different. She had spent 2 years doing the patient, unglamorous work of getting every detail right. Not because she was angry, not because she wanted to win something, but because she understood that love without follow-through is just a feeling, and feelings don't hold up in a probate court. She had the intelligence to see around corners, the discipline to act on what she saw, and the strength to do it quietly, without making it a drama or a declaration. That combination, clear-eyed, steady, and good, is rarer than people think. What I learned, sitting in the sunroom after everything settled, is that the choices we make in the ordinary moments add up to something. Every month, Gloria transferred money into that brokerage account was an ordinary moment. Every phone call with Beverly was an ordinary moment. None of it was heroic. All of it compounded in something that held. And Donnie, I believe he's learning this too, slowly, on his own terms. He comes by on Sundays now, with donuts from the bakery on Route 9, and he sits at the kitchen table and we don't always say much. But he shows up, and showing up, consistently, without an agenda. That's where character actually gets built. Not in the big moments, in the quiet ones. I'm 67 years old, and I'm still figuring things out. But I know this. The people who last in your life, in your memory, in the things they leave behind, are the ones who did the right thing even when it cost them something, who thought carefully about what they were building, and who kept going even when it would have been easier to let it all slide. Gloria was all three. I'm trying to be worthy of what she left me.